Good morning, Dan and Amy. So it seems like Senate Democrats are down to two principal arguments in defense of Ms. Blasey Ford and to the detriment of Brett Kavanaugh. One is that you shouldn't outsource the questions to a third-party prosecutor, this sex crimes prosecutor they're importing from Arizona, Raquel Mitchell. And the other is that the other, in addition to outsourcing, is that there should be this FBI investigation. Those are the two arguments. You've heard them repeated most often from both, from all the Senate Democrats. So to respond to the need for an FBI investigation here, with all of the statements that have already been filed by relevant parties from both sides, essentially, and the press accounts from names that have been offered up by Dr. Blasey Ford, I cede my time to 1991 Joe Biden, when he was on the Senate Judiciary Committee, speaking with a certain Supreme Court nominee named Clarence Thomas.
The next person that refers to an FBI report as being worth anything obviously doesn't understand anything. FBI explicitly does not, in this or any other case, reach a conclusion. Period. Period.
Very emphatic.
Judge, there's no reason why you should know this. The reason why we cannot rely on the FBI report, you wouldn't like it if we did, because it is inconclusive. They say he said, she said, and they said. Period. So when people wave an FBI report before you, understand, they do not reach conclusions. They do not make, as my friend points out more adequately, they do not make recommendations. So, Judge.
So there you have it. And Mazie Hirano from Hawaii, whose profile has really been increased during this saga, much to her detriment.
Yeah, it hasn't helped her.
For people that have sense. She opined on outsourcing the questioning, Republicans enlisting an outside party to question Ms. Blasey Ford.
I think this is an example of the Republicans on the committee not wanting to reveal themselves to the American public, because what should be happening is that we should be asking the questions.
Well, you can ask your own questions. I don't like Republicans on the committee sort of
ceding their time, because each one gets 5 minutes to ask questions. They're ceding their time to this female attorney.
I don't like them capitulating to identity politics and being optics focused. John Cornyn has argued cases before the United States Supreme Court. Is he qualified to ask reasonable, matter-of-fact questions of anybody? Of course he is, and so are the rest of the senators.
Yeah, they can all show compassion, and they're not monsters.
The flip side of that is the left's logic. So the Senate Republicans are old white men, so by definition, Neanderthals, incapable of treating Dr. Blasey Ford fairly. So why would you want to put her through an unfair process? Why would you want to ostensibly re-victimize her again by having her subject herself to Senate Republicans, from your perspective, as opposed to having a professional in this space who prosecutes sex crimes as a matter of course in her daily professional life, and who knows how to treat victims of sex crimes in this context appropriately and ask the probing questions that get to the heart of the matter. So is it you want them to ask questions because you want to score political points, or is it you want to find the truth? It seems if you think the process would be unfair if they ask the questions, then you're not interested in the truth, and I need help squaring that circle. For said help, we're pleased to be joined by David Freddoso, who's a writer and columnist for the Washington Examiner, WashingtonExaminer.com. David, thanks for joining me. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I have to say there isn't much of a circle here to square, though. And in fact, you're right. The idea that, it seems to me that the only point of this complaint is that they would love to see the Republicans ask a bunch of really insensitive questions and make fools of themselves, and that they're upset that that isn't going to happen. I can't figure out any other reason for making this particular argument.
Well, what about the Democrats? I mean, each Democratic senator is going to get 5 minutes, and what do you think Cory Booker and Kamala Harris are going to do?
Well, they've done so much grandstanding with this nomination. This is before any of this, sordid stuff came out. I imagine that talking to the reason they've hired a professional to do this is that you don't just want any prosecutor, even you don't even want just any lawyer like John Cornyn to be asking questions of someone like this in a very politically and otherwise sensitive interrogation, right? You want someone who knows exactly sort of what's appropriate or inappropriate to ask someone in this situation, which is very hard. What I personally expect, although you never know, but what I personally expect is that it's going to be very hard for Democrats to ask questions. And if they're smart, what they'll do is they will take the focus off themselves and let her talk, right? That's what I would do in that situation. But if they get a little too greedy for the limelight, I think they could come off looking very bad.
Do you think it would be better if Senate Democrats on the Judiciary Committee outsourced their questioning to Cory Booker's imaginary friend T-Bone? You think that? Maybe that.
T-Bone. I'd almost forgotten about T-Bone.
Yeah, maybe that would help provide that degree of separation they need, so Cory doesn't get in trouble.
I miss you, T-Bone.
That's right. And when you mentioned Joe Biden talking about faxing the Clarence Thomas hearings in the FBI, this is a very important point that I think people forget. The only reason there even was an FBI investigation in that case is that Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill were both federal employees on federal property when all of the allegations took place. Okay? That's the only reason the FBI ever looked into any of that stuff. And, the Constitution does not say that the FBI gives its advice and consent on Supreme Court nominations. That's the job of Congress, and Congress has its own perfectly good investigatory powers. It has subpoena powers. It has investigators. There are investigators who work for nearly every committee. This is something that, I think this is something that's not going to be solved during this nomination, but that Congress should be looking for ways to beef up its investigatory capabilities. Just to give one example unrelated to this of why it should. I mean, everybody should be thinking, well, Congress should have its investigators go after this. But another reason they should do that is that, look at this whole business with the special counsel, right? We have someone who everybody's saying, oh, is Trump going to fire the special counsel? The special counsel is investigating him. This would be the worst thing ever. Why is an executive branch agency investigating the president at all? Why can't we have investigators who actually are only accountable to Congress so that they have more latitude to do an appropriate investigation that may involve the president, right?
Well, speaking of that, I mean, just on another matter, there are other things happening in the world besides the Kavanaugh Blaise Ford saga. Tomorrow.
That's right. Trump and
Rod Rosenstein meet to discuss his future. And what's your sense of what that future is, and your opinion on what it should be? Particularly with, I was interested to read about this gentleman, Noel Francisco, waiting in the wings, a former Antonin Scalia law clerk. Boy, that seems like that would be a much better fit for Trump's interests and perhaps the interests of justice overseeing Mueller than has Rosenstein been.
Right. Well, look, my attitude toward this investigation all along has been that the more Trump says about it, the more it hurts him, and that the investigation itself is not going to hurt him. It seems highly unlikely, even with this Manafort news. I mean, you have the liberals kind of waiting for the great pumpkin here to show up and say that, Trump committed some kind of treason. I don't know. It's sort of hard even to define what they're expecting. It's so unrealistic. This was always a probe that was going to end up catching Manafort for his illegal activities, which people knew about even during the 2016 presidential campaign. They're saying, why is this guy being picked to run this thing, right? So I don't think that it's helpful to Trump to fire Rosenstein. And indeed, he's not going to. It looks like the Washington Post is reporting that Rosenstein is going to survive right through the midterm for sure, and that maybe after that he'll be decapitated. But that at least for now he's safe.
Yeah, but how could you trust him when he was?
Honestly, it would be very unhelpful to Trump to start firing people. If he had just not fired Comey, I'm convinced that this investigation would already be over.
But, I mean, it's hard to keep somebody on your team if you don't trust them. I mean, whether he was joking or not, he tried to, get his boss by secretly recording him.
Well, see, now that's the thing. We don't know that. And if you read carefully between the lines of the New York Times report on that and the Washington Post follow-up, what you will see is that, other people who were in that meeting actually, now look, I agree. If he actually said we should look into the 25th Amendment and getting rid of Trump, you should secretly record what the president says, then yes, he's got to go. No question about it at all. That's completely inappropriate. I mean, compared to impeachment, the 25th Amendment is just over the cliff, because impeachment at least is a process that has some democracy to it, right? You voted for those members of Congress. If they get rid of the president, they must have a good reason to. With the 25th Amendment, and for a non-cabinet member especially to discuss the 25th Amendment, it's just completely inappropriate. Okay, so, having established that, though, it looks like in the Washington Post follow-up, some of the people who were involved in that conversation say that it happened very differently, and that McCabe may have tried in his memo to implicate Rosenstein, right? That those two guys may not have gotten along, and that McCabe, who was the one who wanted to investigate Trump, and when Rosenstein said something to him like, "What are you going to do, record the president?" he wrote down a memo that said, Rosenstein suggested recording the president. So, if anything, that is the reason why Rosenstein's not being fired, and it makes sense that he wouldn't be.
He is David Freddoso, writer and columnist for the Washington Examiner, WashingtonExaminer.com. David, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.